Welcome to the Courage Curve, a space for women who are standing at the edge of a shift or already moving through one. I'm Parul. My life has been shaped by steady decisions, inner resilience, and the moments where I had to choose courage long before I had clarity. Each week, I will speak with women who simply didn't arrive at a breakthrough. They built it step by step. From the outside, the transformation can look instantaneous, but together we will uncover the real story, the pressure, the truth-telling, the small choices that create the inflection point that we call the courage curve. Let these conversations stay close to you as you move through your own curve with strength, honesty, and companionship. I'm honored to sit with a woman whose life has been shaped by art, activism, and an unshakable commitment to truth. Judy Juanita is a poet, novelist, playwright, professor, and a lifelong cultural force who grew up in Oakland during the civil rights era. She was part of the original cadre of the Black Panther Party, and her writing captures both the personal and political with raw clarity. From the front lines of protest to the front of the classroom, Judy has never stopped questioning power or illuminating the margins. Her voice is bold, lyrical, and necessary. Today, we talk about what it means to age with agency, how art can be a weapon and a bomb, and why being a troublemaker may just be a sacred calling. Judy, welcome.
Thank you, Parul. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for this conversation. So, as I mentioned, I know a little bit about you. I know that you're a published and award-winning author. You've been in academia all your life. You were part of the Black Panther Party and editor of their publications. What else would you like people to know about you?
I would like people to know that my grandmother, Marguerite Hodges, told my mother, Marguerite Juanita Hodges, that's where the Juanita came from, when I was about 5 years old. She said, "Marguerite, you never have to worry about Judy. Whatever goes in here comes out here." So, I don't remember that, of course, being said about me when I was a kid. But when my mother told me that, I was well into my 50s or whatever. And I understood that I have a quality of being a channel, and of hearing it, seeing it, observing it, and then not keeping it to myself. And my son said when he was a teenager, my beloved son, Juno, said, "Mommy, were you a murder mouth when you were a kid?" And a murder mouth is somebody who really just talks excessively. And I said, "Yes, but we didn't call it that. We called it a chatterbox." Okay, that was the nickname for it. So, yes, I'm a big mouth. I keep things out. And one of my friends, I've been chanting over 40 years, 44, 45 years. And one of my best buddies, Julie, said, "Judy, that's why you're so light." Light skin. She meant buoyant.
As a person, yeah.
Because you don't keep things in. It has to come out. I'm not going, if I don't write it out, talk it out, it's going to burst out in some way. Yeah. So that's just a central quality of my personality.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of power in saying the truth with agency, as you do. So there is an element of you're just not saying anything that comes in and goes out. There's a lot of processing that happens, and you share it in a manner that's empowering. At least it's empowering to me when I hear you talk. So, and the writing that I've read, that you've written.
I think that comes from my mother and father, who were truth tellers, who were no BS kinds of people. They were raised in Oklahoma, in a very segregated part of the South, or in the segregated South. And my father was what was called then a race man. That was a black man who didn't put up with the white man's oppression. They spoke out against it. They protested against it. They led movements against it. So they migrated from Oklahoma to California during World War II. Actually, my father right before World War II and my mother during and after. So I was born here in Berkeley, California, but those Southern roots are very strong. They had a moral compass that they kept to the very last moment of each of their lives. My father, both of them would say, I don't care if 99% of the kids in the classroom are doing wrong. You'll be the 1%, who's doing right. They used to say that all the time in one form or another. And it used to irritate me tremendously. And I didn't know what it meant until, of course, I got grown. And they were really saying, hold your ground, be truthful, act with morality. And they said it in a number of different ways. I was raised by people they were flawed. They were flawed, which I focused on the flaws when I was younger until I became a parent myself and saw flaws in action, up close and personal. But they gave me that as a basis.
A very strong moral compass. And I think it's showed in your writing. Let's talk about the time you were growing up in Oakland. So you grew up in Oakland in the 1950s and 60s. Describe what that was like for you. Because for me as an outsider, moving into Oakland a few years ago, I saw very rich culture, very rich history. And it seemed like that the history and the culture was shaped over the decades through an artistic expression, but a desire to think outside the box, not follow the norm. And that was kind of my take on Oakland. So what was it like for you?
Black culture was a part of my everyday life. Oakland was a great instance of de facto segregation. De jure segregation means by law. You can't go in certain parts. De facto is how real estate agents would redline the parts of the town so that they only sold houses or they only allowed Black people to live in one part of the community. Black people were not allowed to live above International Boulevard first. Black people then lived in the flatlands. So we moved there in Oakland in 1952. By the mid-60s, things were changing and Black people were buying homes in East 14th, which now is International Boulevard, and Bancroft, and then slowly edging up to the hills. Okay. Businesses, soul food restaurants, Black cleaners, those kinds of things were very strong. And my parents were a part of that from when they lived in Berkeley, because I grew up first in Berkeley. I was born in Berkeley, and we lived in Berkeley until 52. So my mother and father owned the only Black-owned cab company in Berkeley, okay? And it served a wide area. So I had this model of self-sufficiency, independence, of no matter what the white man doles out to you, you do your best.
Yeah.
And that's the Oakland that I grew up in. So our Oakland, that's not the Oakland that it became, but our Oakland, my Oakland, was full of very proud, self-sufficient Black people, and the Black church was extremely important as a social institution. So wherever you go in the Black community, there was the Black church. And my father, who actually wanted to be a preacher when he was a young man, but got disillusioned with it. But nevertheless, he was very street smart. But nevertheless, on Sunday morning, we had to get dressed and get in that car, and he'd drive us to church every single Sunday. I had to go to church every Sunday until I left home at age 20. My siblings, we all had to go to church. So that you can see, those are our boundaries. Those are strictures and structures. Okay. It was a very strict upbringing. My mother was very religious. My mother was considered a pillar of the church.
In your book, The De Facto Feminism, you talk about the society a little bit during that time. And my understanding was that there were people, all sorts of immigrants moving into the neighborhood at the time. And Oakland was also becoming like a melting pot. And you got to learn from different cultures as well during that time.
Yes. I lived on a street called East Lawn Street, which people in East Oakland know very well. And my neighbors at that time were, I'm just remembering, Frankie. Yeah. Frankie and his family were from Hawaii. The Chavezes down the street were from Mexico. Yeah. The Ojedas across the street were from Mexico. The Norrises were whites, and they brought their prejudices with them, something I had written about in poems and in short stories. It was really a mini United Nations on that street. And we all played together and had big fun together. One of our huge um, um, fun activities were backyard sleepouts. There we'd get, because the weather in Oakland is so mild,
Yeah.
and it's basically 62 degrees year round average temperature.
Yeah.
So we'd get blankets and construct tents, bring pillows from the house. And then our parents would let us have potato chips, cookies, pop. Just, and it was just fun. And we'd spend all night, and the girls would be in one yard and the boys would be in another yard and probably across the street. And of course, in the middle of the night, we'd play hide and seek and different games. It was very innocent, but it was huge fun. We looked forward to that. And it would be held in different people's backyards, depending on.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it was big fun. I remember that very fondly now.
That's amazing. And you then, I'm assuming, got the exposure to different cultures as well.
Yes.
How old were you at the time?
I moved there when I was 6. In one sense, it was wholesome, but one thing I noticed when I was young, and I asked my mother about it, I said, why do the white people go to one kind of church and the Black people go to another kind of church? Are we praying to different gods? I thought there was just one God in the sky, but do the white people, are their prayers different? Because there was one church on Havens Court Boulevard that was integrated. And I went to it, and I could see that it was very different from the Black church. It wasn't lively and with song in the way that we did it in the Black church.
What was that church like?
It was a little more sedate. It was very friendly. They always had lots of activities for kids. I mean, it was wonderful, but it was just integrated, and it was sedate.
Yeah.
It was a little more sedate, but one thing about it, it was much shorter, and I like that about it. But I went a couple of times with some of the neighborhood kids, and I noticed, they let out earlier, so more time to play.
Interesting. And then you also mentioned you started writing when you were very, very young. I think you were
Yes.
about 6 years old when you started writing.
I remember my earliest memory is 8. My mother wanted smart children, so she taught us to read at 2 and 3 years old. That was one of her objectives. She said that's why she married my dad. So I began writing for a feature in the Oakland Tribune at 8 years old.
Wow.
It was called the Aunt Elsie page. And you sent in your little stories or poems. Mine were most all stories about dogs. I lost dogs and dog puppies who had lost their way, as I recall. You send in your story, and you could write it by out longhand, or your mommy could type it for you. That's what my mommy did for me a lot. And you sent it in, and your section came out with your story and your name. So my name at that time was Judy Hart. And I was so happy, so excited. The bonus was that they sent you coloring books, or colored pencils, skate keys. You got all these different little treats, the crossword puzzle books, and they came in the mail. So then that meant at a very early age, as a writer, I was used to 2 things. I was used to submission, putting my work in an envelope and sending it to somebody to see if they would print it. And I was used to seeing my name in print.
That was a great incentive.
And it all pleased my mother.
Nice.
Okay? Because my mother was very, very influential in my development as a writer.
She would critique your work? Did she also critique your work and made it better?
No. This is what she did. She was from Oklahoma, and her family was back in Oklahoma. And she wrote to her mother 2, 3, and this is what people did in the United States.
Right.
She wrote 2, 3 letters a week to her mother. Well, when mommy would come home from work, she would be getting dinner on. So she would say, Judy, and I would sit there, and she would dictate the letter to her mother, telling her about all the activities and what had happened at work and each kids were doing. And I would sign it.
Yeah.
Love, Bobby. That was my mother's nickname, Bobby.
Yeah.
Love Bobby.
Yeah.
And I would seal it, and I would put it in the mail. The mailbox was 2 blocks away. And I would walk to the mailbox, and then I'd come home, dinner would be ready. So I started out, that's called an amanuensis. And that's somebody who's a secretary to a writer and either writes their words down or transcribes them. So I started doing that. I did that for a number of years. And I didn't even know that was my training as a writer, but it was, And my mom's a great storyteller, but she had to get dinner on.
So you kind of learned that style from her, or her storytelling influenced your style.
I learned her storytelling because my mom could tell some tall tales. I didn't know sometimes whether what she was saying was true or not.
Very interesting.
But I loved it. I was a devoted first daughter. I was the oldest daughter of three. I was the second child of four, but I was the oldest daughter of the three daughters. So I had an older brother. So oldest daughters in Black families and in many other cultures have a distinct responsibility.
In our culture as well.
I stepped into it all the way.
Fantastic. All right. So then my other question, just related to your upbringing, was that in your book, De Facto Feminism, you also mentioned Motown. And my impression of that was that it was a really significant time in the history of America as sort of the two cultures were blending in a way. But tell me more about that time and how did you feel growing up during that time?
Black music was supreme. It was extremely important. And we listened to 45s or 45 RPM to 45 records. And we'd go to a department store in downtown Oakland in the 50s when we were kids. And you could buy 5 45s for $1. Get them in. We'd have a little bitty, nothing fancy, a little bitty record player, and we'd play the records. And we had the neighborhood kids in all the time, and we were dancing and forming little groups. And at that time, the schools had what were called sock hops, and sock hops were very popular. And you just took off your shoes and you danced in your socks in the gymnasium. And I love to dance. So it was just a wonderful, freeing experience. The Black music was played on a couple of soul stations. One was called KSOL radio stations. They were AM stations, so they had broadband. And one was called KSAN, one was called KDIA. So we got all the latest music, and then we'd hear it on the radio and go down to Swan's and buy it with our little allowance money. Or my brother and I were always working little jobs. My brother had a paper route, and I always did babysitting. So we always had that little money in our pocket, and we'd have the parties, and my brother was known as this incredible dancer. So what happened about Motown was this. Berry Gordy, first of all, we'll go back to American Bandstand, was a popular dance show, and there was an equivalent of it called the Dance Party on KPIX Channel 5 here in the Bay Area. But on American Bandstand, it was strictly segregated, and for many, many years in the 50s into the early 60s, you didn't see any Blacks. You only saw the white kids in Philly, mostly Italians. And it was very popular, but they would have Black acts, and they would have Little Richard and Chuck Berry. Sometimes they would have maybe an act like The Moon Glows, but very seldom. It was mainly for whites. And then that's why Berry Gordy decided he was working in Detroit on the auto factory line, but he had a musical inclination, musical talent all throughout his family. And he decided that he wanted to break the color barrier, and he wanted Black music to go mainstream. Okay?
Right.
Because before that, Black music was covered by whites. And in other words, Big Mama Thornton made "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog. I just do it all the time." Okay? So she made that, but Colonel Tom Parker saw that he could get his young protege, Elvis, to cover that song and Elvis made the millions off of it. The Blacks didn't make the money off of the covers. So Berry Gordy, with his business mind, his acumen already setting in, saw a great opportunity. And he started Motown and pushed for the distribution. And of course, we know there's something, maybe you don't know, but there's something called payola.
No, I don't know what that is.
That's when record companies pay DJs under the table to play their hits over and over again.
Okay.
Okay. So it's dishonest, it's illegal, it's corrupt, but that's how hits get made, not by sheer talent, but by the record companies greasing the palms of the DJs. So Berry Gordy was reputed to be a part of that and knew how to play the game. Okay. I'll just leave it at that. Somebody else has documented it.
I see. And that's how sort of the Black music became more mainstream and accessible to everyone.
Well, it's part of it. The other thing was that there was just an enormous amount of talent in Detroit that Berry Gordy saw. And it wasn't only in Detroit, it was in Philly, it was in New York City. Because what Blacks did they did street corner singing. And many Blacks came up through the Black church, as I did. So they had training, wonderful training for singing, for gospel, but there's gospel and rhythm and blues are linked. They're integral to one another, with the riffs and the guitars and the bass beat and the piano and the organ. They're very, very linked. So Aretha Franklin, a gospel circuit, and she was there with Sam Cooke doing the gospel circuit. Sam Cooke crossed over into R&B, and Aretha crossed over into R&B very young when she was a teenager. So the story is that Berry Gordy didn't want Aretha because her sound was too gut, too soulful. Did a little more pristine of a sound, which he got from Diana Ross.
Interesting.
And Berry Gordy's Motown put great emphasis on choreography.
Yeah.
So, and they even gave these young Black kids from Brewster Projects, I believe it was called, I don't know, gave them etiquette lessons and so forth, so that they could handle themselves outside of the Chitlin circuit.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yes.
Amazing.
It's a wonderful history. But there was an enormous amount of talent. Detroit was one of the first stops up from the South.
Wow.
So people migrated to Detroit, and they brought their soulfulness with them. And so the two lead singers of the Temptations, my girl, David Ruffin and Eddie, I can't think of his last name.
That's okay. And you told me yesterday that you would have either become a writer or a singer.
Yes.
So did you learn to sing in your church as well?
Yes, I did.
And how did the music speak to you in terms of becoming your calling compared to writing? How did you pick one over the other?
There was no choice. I sang in the choir, and our gospel chorus went all around Northern California to gospel fests. They were like on Sundays, and you'd go to different churches. Well, I heard the Pointer Sisters before they were the Pointer Sisters. We went to Sylvester Stewart's father's church. Sylvester Stewart became Sly Stone. So I heard these people with incredible voices. There was no way my voice could match any of that. I was very humbled. I was humbled by the voices in my own church choir. So I never thought of myself as having a voice for becoming a professional. My sister, who has passed, she had the voice, and she was in a group for a number of years, but I didn't think of myself in that way. So writing was always superior. So what I do in the choir, I wrote love letters for other girls for a quarter each.
Okay.
They wanted me to write love letters to their boyfriends, and they
because you were so artistic in your writing, they wanted to that talent.
Well, I would write them a love letter, and I'd say, it's quarter for it,
Oh my God. So you started doing your business when you were very young.
Yeah. And of course, my mother never knew about that, but the choir director knew, and she'd always give me the evil eye, when I'd be sitting there scribbling it. And I also had a beautiful handwriting. So they wanted the handwriting and the little romantic touch.
Very cool. Very cool. So you grew up, then you went to San Francisco State, and then you decided to join the Black Panther Party.
Okay. I grew up and I entered Oakland City College, which is now Merritt College. I
Okay.
entered it at age 16. I graduated from high school because I had been skipped a grade. Graduated from high school at age 16 on a Friday. Following Monday, I went down and enrolled in college at Oakland City College. In other words, a community college. I went in and attended right away. That was 1963. And many years later, the Attorney General of California would say that Merritt College was a hotbed of radicalism. So it was located then on Grove Street, which became Martin Luther King Boulevard. Grove Street had along the front of the school, spanning maybe 3 blocks, had all these orators from um, Young Socialist Alliance, Students for Democratic Society, B. Du Bois Club. All of these orators were fair play for Cuba. And I talk about that in Virgin Soul, my novel. And I didn't know what any of this meant. And I really didn't care what any of it meant. My friends and I, my girlfriends, my best buddies, we'd go out and just look to see when are they going to faint from heat prostration, because they could talk for hours at a time. I'd go and then I'd go to my class for a couple of hours and come back, and the same guys would be there. Maybe somebody would bring them a cup of water or what have you. But
Yeah.
I mean, it was just hilarious, and it was a scene. I didn't understand
Mm.
time that I was taking in by
Mm.
osmosis these radical ideas. And that's what Evel Younger, the state attorney general, understood, is that it was a hotbed for radicalism. So I did not join any of that while I was at City College, but I was still a newspaper reporter on the college paper.
Okay.
When the Black ones, their names were Isaac Moore, Ernie Allen Jr., who I had grown up with, Ken Freeman. When they talked, I realized something different was occurring. I asked my editor, whose name was John Opadahl, who many, many years later became the editor of the publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle. But at that time, he was just a pimply faced kid from Alameda. And I had to convince him that these were, quote, the new Negroes. And they didn't call themselves Negroes, they called themselves Black. And I wanted to do a story on them. So I did stories on them. And among them also were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. So I did stories on all of them. And
So Huey and Bobby were with you in Merritt College.
yes, Huey, I mentioned this in branding on my novel, Virgin Soul. Huey's locker, we had lockers then, right next, his girlfriend's locker was right next to mine. He had a white girlfriend, and my locker was right outside of the tower's offices. The tower was the school paper. And Huey came all the time looking for her. Always asked me, have you seen her? Have you seen her? You know, I think her name was Margaret or Peggy. You know, and she and I were close because we took French together and we took Western civilization together. So we often practiced our French together. And she was a white girl from a very middle class family, lived in the big houses up on College Avenue. And we took tennis together. We had a lot of contact. So he was right in asking me where she was. We had a lot of contact, but that's how I initially got to know Huey Newton.
Okay.
You know, so, but I wasn't going to be a radical when I was there. I was under the influence of my parents. My parents were get your education, transfer. They had wanted me to go to San Francisco State right away, but I didn't want to go for a number of reasons, including that I was not a bougie. Okay. A bougie is, you probably know the term now, but Black kids who were middle class, their parents were realtors, judges, they lived in the hills, they drove Stingrays, and their parents were firemen, and they had lots of clothes, and they joined the Greek sororities and fraternities. I didn't want to be a part of that. You know, I had seen those class distinctions from a very early age, and I didn't like them. And what I saw was that was the way you got a boyfriend, was that you had to measure up to those standards, and then a boyfriend would be interested in you because you met those standards. I didn't want any part of that. And I didn't know what I wanted, but I know I didn't want any part of that. And so also now I can look back and I can see that that in a sense, my intellectual side was developing all the while. And I wanted not to be hampered by class distinctions, by sexual distinctions. I wanted to think what I wanted to think. And I understood, even if I couldn't articulate it, I understood that the Bay Area was an extremely wonderful and unique place. And I explored many aspects of intellectual life in Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco, either on my own or with a buddy. So, in cultural life, I just explored it on my own. So I wasn't going to be limited. And my very best friend from high school and college, from junior high and high school, went to Cisco State her first year, and she flunked out. And she was a straight A over straight A student.
Okay.
Yeah, and I said, "How could you flunk out? You're smart. What
Yeah.
happened?"
Yeah.
And it was very hard for her to explain it to me. She said, "Oh, but it took me years to understand that she also didn't want to be a part of that bourgeois scene. But
Right.
she didn't know how to, and her parents were very down to earth, plain spoken people. She didn't want to be a part of that either, and she never has become a part of that. But that was the end of her college road. So that helped me to see a phenomenon that many people drop out of college during the first year because it's such a shock and it's so different. And if you don't join up with one of the forces, you're at a loss. And one of my good friends many, many years later, who went to Simmons College in Boston, she's about 5 years younger than I am. So she went still during that 60s era, 69 or so. And she said they sat in orientation, they sat the students down and they said, "Okay, you have a choice. Either join the BSU, the Black Student Union, or SDS, for Democratic Society." In other words, you had to choose. She said there was no middle ground. You chose one or the other. And that's the way it was then. So my friend stuck with it. She chose the BSU and she prospered. But it was a tough reality. So I appreciate being in the Bay Area where I had lots of room to grow and I had options. I didn't have to choose to get with the radicals in my first 2 years at Merritt. However, when I transferred to San Francisco State, the country had changed tremendously. The war had deepened in Vietnam. Every summer, there were urban conflagrations, which were called riots, terrible things, riots that lasted 8, 9, 11, 12 days in all the major cities, Miami, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And when these riots occurred, there were deaths, and there were deaths of Black people, and there were deaths of police. So the Black Panther Party then started up in 66. Well, by then I had just transferred to San Francisco State. In 67, when Huey and Bobby came to San Francisco State recruiting, just like IBM and Clorox. They got a room. They had sign-up sheets in the back. My roomies and I went. I had 4 roomies. We had a spacious 9-room flat on Potomac Street in San Francisco. And we got up. We had our big naturals, our fros, our earrings. We were just as hip as we could be. And we went. And my roomies took in what Huey and Bobby were saying, the spiel, and they wanted to join right then. And they signed up the papers. Well, I didn't because I had this civil servant mother who had taught me never sign away your name, your body, or your birthright. In other words, your country. You just don't sign those things away. And also I said to my roomies, I know these guys from Oakland City College, they're not playing hopscotch. I knew how serious and how strong their movement was. Right. That was spring. The urban riots, this was 67, were so strong, so horrible, so horrifying that I joined within a couple of months. So each of us, we were called by certain people, the Sisters with Skills, because we were the first group, 5 students to join the Black Panther Party from San Francisco State. And each of us had a specific skill. Joanne could commandeer the troops. Betty worked the office Evelyn was good with finances. She became the party treasurer this was all for limited amounts of time at that point. And Janice became Bobby Seale's scheduler. So I had all the journalism experience, and they sent me right away to work with Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver on the newspaper. So there you go.
Interesting. And my understanding, kind of reading some of the things from that time, especially when the Black Panther Party was formed, it was considered very male dominated. What was your experience working with Huey and Bobby so closely?
First of all, the world was male dominated, and the world is still male dominated. So all the civil rights movements were led by men, except for the National Council of Negro Women led by Dorothy Height. So this is par for the course.
Okay.
Par for the course.
So that's just how life was. You and your friends still had sort of important roles to play in the party.
Yes. Yeah. Women always play very important roles in movements, in churches, and institutions. It's just that the role is often minimized publicly. The person out front is usually a male. But I have always been behind the scenes working, and I know the impact of women. Even as a child, when my mother was the recording secretary and the secretary of the church for decades, I knew then that the behind the scenes workers are what makes the upfront work. That's really what one of my themes in my work continuing is always look behind the scenes, because that's where the real drama plays out. And that's where sacrifices are made. Yes, the top leaders do often have to sacrifice their lives, as we saw that with almost all the Black leaders. They gave their lives for the cause, but always behind that were the worker bees, what I call the worker bees. So I was always a worker bee. Yes, but women, and I write about this a lot.
Yeah.
I write about it in De Facto Feminism. Women, we have our weapons. And one of the weapons is sexuality, childbirthing, parenting, raising kids. And one of them is our mouth, our gut instinct.
Yes.
Which men often profit from through pillow talk. Okay. So definitely I understood that phenomenon right away in the Black Panther Party. And actually records show that women always were about 2/3 of the party. But the media likes the picture of the Black guys with the bandoliers and the berets and the guns. They like that picture. And they like Huey in the peacock chair.
Right.
But nobody likes the picture of me sitting there doing Instaprint and putting the paper together and typing up the Minister of Education's chicken scratching, which would take me hours to transcribe. Nobody likes that. Several people say, how come I don't see more pictures of you in the party? And I said, I was deeply embedded, baby. I was working.
So let's talk about that, because for you, it was a little bit different. You were the strength of the organization in the back end, and then you became the editor-in-chief for the newsletter, right? And that, I would imagine, is a very big responsibility for a young woman such as yourself.
Yes, it was a big responsibility, but it wasn't a power position. During the time that I became editor-in-chief, and I was appointed because Eldridge was incarcerated, Eldridge then was jailed. Huey was jailed.
Right.
Okay. So they had plenty of time to write and read. I had no idea. I was 21. I had no idea what I was being asked to do. I had never been an editor before. I had been a reporter at community newspapers, at school papers. So I had been a journalist, but I didn't know what an editor did. So I found out. An editor compiles all of this work and makes, syntax, grammar changes, so forth, and then make sure that it gets to the printer. Okay? So that was my role. And I didn't make any policy decisions. It was very clear. And I call Eldridge, Cleaver, Huey Newton, and Bobby Seale in several pieces that I write. I call them Huelbo. 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 Because they were in charge. Yeah. They made the decisions. We got reams and reams of position papers and instructions from Huey in jail, from Eldridge. Bobby was he was in charge of the troops outside, and he was an incredible speaker. So he was on the road a lot. But so I want to be clear, it wasn't as though I was sitting there, dictating policy. No, not at all. That was done by the Central Committee. But so I was still a worker bee. And many came after me and did the same thing, that editor-in-chief position. It changed with, when Eldridge got out of prison, he had promised his prison mate that he could be that in that position. And I got bumped out of that. Somebody else replaced him, but it was a fortunate spot for a few women who were able to do that, And when I say fortunate, I don't mean that we could add it to our resume, because we couldn't at that point. You couldn't walk in and get a job saying you had experience on the Black Panther paper, not when J. Edgar Hoover, the Black Panther Party, domestic terrorists. For many decades, people were afraid of you if they knew you had been a Black Panther, unless you were the iconic ones, the famous ones. Other than that, you didn't put that on your resume. It wasn't until the 2010s, that the Panthers, legacy began to be fully appreciated, when people understood the extent of police oppression and police brutality. In the 1990s, when Rodney King was beaten by the LA Police Department, and that video was shown all over television, my own mother cried. And, I was sitting there with her, and I said, "Mom, this is what we were protesting against in the Black Panther Party." And she said, "I know, but to see it like this is so heartbreaking." So, people have to see things. This is why we honor a Rodney King and we honor a George Floyd. They were martyrs. They were activists in fact, de facto activists, because they, in various instances gave their lives, those and many others who were slain by the police.
Yeah. Now, you've observed Black activism from the 1960s to now, to Black Lives Matter. What patterns or changes stand out to you when it comes to the resilience, the strategy, and storytelling of this activism?
Literacy. Okay. In the 60s, we had PE classes. And that's political education classes. We had many organizations, including in the Bay Area, the Afro-American Association, created and led by Don Wharton, an attorney who influenced Bobby Seale and Huey Newton tremendously. And apparently Barack Obama also at a later point. This Afro-American Association had meetings every Sunday. I didn't go to any of them, just heard about them. But they met every Sunday. Well, what were they doing? They had Black history lessons. They went over important literature that people needed to read. So during the day, you studied that work. You studied Frantz Fanon. You studied Black historians, Blasingame, and so forth. You studied these things so that when you went to the rally that night or that afternoon, you knew what they were talking about.
Right.
Right? You knew what they were talking about. That's where that push for Black studies came. The push for Black studies came from Black young college students who knew that this history, this politic, wasn't being taught in the schools. This anthropology wasn't being taught in college classes. We were given the white man's version of history. And from that, then Black students throughout the country, Cornell, Columbia, wherever, had to demonstrate and protest and make sure that the curriculum was changed. So the San Francisco State College strike, which is the longest strike in student history in American higher education, changed the face of American higher education with two things: open enrollment, the insistence that a certain portion of the enrollment be set aside for people of color.
Right.
Okay? And Black studies, which became ethnic studies. That opened the door for women's studies, gay studies, everything different. different kinds of studies came out of that.
So what is different today? Are you saying that?
Where's the study? Where's the study? Where is the study?
Hmm.
I was on a panel at Laney College where I teach with somebody from the Black Lives Matter movement. And afterwards, I asked that question.
Yeah.
What are you studying? What's your equivalent of a 10-point platform? And basically they couldn't answer. And I said, you can't just make this up in front of the TV cameras, you know? That's not a movement. You have to study how other revolutionaries in the United States and throughout the world conducted their movements,
Hmm.
you know? But, this person, I don't think and then we see the Black Lives Matter took money and went and bought mansions in Malibu and all this ridiculous stuff. They weren't answerable. But the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement were very study oriented. There were freedom schools throughout to teach in the civil rights movement. I think it was called Highlander. They taught the principles of nonviolence and Gandhi, and they taught people how to resist nonviolently, how to go limp, how to survive in the jail. So that movement in the 60s was not something that was spontaneous and just an instantaneous response to the police killing somebody. That's what, quote, the people did, that instantaneous response. But the organizations were studying. We can even go back to 1909, if you will, to the Niagara movement, which led to the NAACP. We can go back to that. We can go back to Garveyism.
Sure.
We can go back to the Nation of Islam's founding in the 1930s by Farad, and then Elijah Muhammad taking up that. We
Right.
can go back to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the 90s, starting before then and then carrying that strategy up through the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So I'm saying that all through that, this legacy of activism, study, understanding of revolutionary movements, and I'm bringing in the longshoremen and the labor unions there too also. This was all going on, and people studied their forerunners. So that's what's missing now. I had a young person in my family, and this person was getting very involved, and I mentioned that, and I don't know if that person took heed of that or what, but it can't just spring off the top of your head.
Yeah. That's so interesting how things change and evolve over a period of time. I do think would be remiss if we don't cover a little bit about your move from West Coast to East Coast. I know it's going to be a longer story, but I do want to touch upon that a little bit. You and I were chatting yesterday. Being associated with Black Panther Party, after you graduated college or school, you started working a little bit here in West Coast. But as you mentioned, being part of PPP wasn't really a resume builder, especially in West Coast. So then you went to East Coast and then you were there for a long time. Just maybe briefly catch us up on how your life evolved, because I want to get to the point that you started there and now you're this amazing published author, and that road wasn't easy. So just share a little bit about that journey.
So there was a radical spread after the high of the 60s and our great participation. We were powerful students. We had power on campus. We ran stuff. We ran the campus. The Black Student Union of the 60s was a very powerful organization. It's been documented. I'm not revealing anything new. We bought guns for the Black Panther Party. We were closely allied with the Black Panther Party. So we were very powerful students. And then we graduated. Okay. And we became just like anybody else, out there looking for a job, So what happened to many of the people of the movements, both the white kids and the Black kids and the brown kids, okay, is we moved. So the hippie movements, if you will, then perhaps many of them migrated north to Mendocino. Communes, went up to Portland, so forth. I'm doing broad strokes, okay? Blacks perhaps went on to grad schools elsewhere. Maybe some moved back down south in a movement for authenticity. Okay. So we had to deal with life as regular people because we had to earn a living. Many of us by that time, including myself, had families and we had to face another reality. So my husband then, Clarence Buzz Thomas, and I moved to New Jersey and began a whole nother life as a family there. And I I kept up my writing, but I was really a mother and a wife more than I was a writer at that point. And I loved motherhood, loved it, still love it. And I was very absorbed in actually what turned out to be a marriage that wasn't working any longer because, we got married at 20 and 21. And by the time we were 30 and 31, it was over. And so I had to make my way in life. And by that time, I was writing very regularly. I was submitting, but I knew I needed to get in a writing group. But I didn't have the cojones. I didn't have the courage at that point to expose my writing to total strangers. I was intimidated. However, at that point, the marriage had deteriorated. Didn't I was used to living on two incomes and had to live on one. So at that point, a lifeline presented itself, and it was chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And I joined the SGI when I was 34, but I had started chanting when I was 31. And as soon as I officially joined this Buddhist organization called SGI USA, Nichiren Buddhism, I got a scroll, which is called a Gohanzan. And I began chanting. You get a scroll in your house and you chant to it. And it's a scroll with lettering on it. But the lettering basically says you always have an enlightened self that you can rely upon every moment in the midst of everything that's going on in life, in your life and in society, in the world, in the universe. Once I began chanting to that, really, actually, within 4 days, I found a writing group. And this writing group was about 8 blocks from my house. I lived in a suburb in New Jersey called Ridgewood. Nice little suburb, pretty much like a Piedmont here, to which I had moved so my son could have good schooling. And that started 30 years of working my writing, developing it in writing workshops, finding mentors all over the place, developing lifelong friendships. But there were people there who told me, submit here, submit there, come do this, come do that, come with us here. And so for 2 years, I was in that group called the Bergen Poets in Bergen County, New Jersey, northern New Jersey. And many, many opportunities developed for me through there. So that was the beginning. And it was such a rich, wonderful association that began with many other writers. And it's continued to this day. I did the Fillmore Jazz Festival just over the weekend.
Yeah.
My beautiful grandson, was there with me. And who comes up but Adrian Oliver, who is the creator of the Black Storytellers Recording and Association. And I've done several things for her, as has my sister. There we were. Wherever you go, you're going to find these wonderful associations that it enriched my life. And then I enriched other people's lives through that.
Yeah. And I think you're skipping some of the details there because
Yes,
as I
of
was,
course.
reading the de facto feminism, you've actually dove into the elements of your life which you needed to get exposure to make your writing even more whole. Like your stand-up comedian phase, or, when you were doing stand-up comedy. I also read in your book where, again, writing was a very male-dominated form and a sort of organization where sometimes they wanted to use your stories or your essays, but wouldn't pay you for it. And you would often take stand and not give in to those requests as they would come up. And I thought that was such an empowering thing to do, to stand in your power like that. And I know it's a longer story, but I'm glad you mentioned Nichiren Buddhism. Tell us a little bit more about that exposure that you had and just how did that enrich your life?
You mean Buddhism? Somebody just told me about it, in conversation, and I was intrigued. And it was a lifeline in the midst of having many, many problems. And immediately I began to see when I chanted that what I perceived as disharmony in the world and problems in the world were actually a reflection of some disharmony within my own life. One of the things that I saw was that speed was a problem in my life, that I moved too fast. Now I can look back and I can understand that what I was beginning to approach and see was that I was shallow. Um, and that I had many opportunities. I could meet many friends. I could meet many guys. I could go to many parties. I could go to a lot of protests. But where was the depth? Where was the depth? And that's what was lacking in my writing. And various people noted that at various other writers and mentors said, right here is where you can go deep. Why aren't you going deep with this? And I avoided that for a long time because I was having so much fun as a person, just doing so many things that in other words, that talent for versatility and for curiosity, that native curiosity of mine was an overwhelming factor in my life. So people, when they begin chanting to that scroll, they notice a couple of things. And many people notice that their lives speed up. That didn't happen to me. And I went to the meetings and I said, I don't understand. I said, when I chant in front of the Gohanzan, I get sleepy and words feel like taking a nap. I didn't understand that for many years, but the universe was saying, slow down, sweetie, slow your roll. You have a lot to reflect on. And I stayed back on the East Coast for another 10 years after I had the Gohanzan. Okay. And as a writer, I continued writing all kinds of things. I really don't think I understood what my voice was until after 10 years of chanting. And because my dad was very seriously ill, I moved back to California to help my mother take care of my father. It was a wonderful homecoming. However, what I began to realize is that, oh my gosh, I'm a California writer. I'm a Californian. I hadn't understood that because the New York, New Jersey tri-state scene for me is so exciting. I made many dear friends that I'm dear friends with to this day.
But you found your depth here in California.
Yes, I did.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah. So, but all of this was a gradual process and none of this happened overnight, as it couldn't. It can't happen. Gaining wisdom about your own life and about society, takes a long time. Gore Vidal, the writer, said a writer's toolbox is their childhood. And that's what I found when I came back, that the richness of growing up in Oakland and the Panther experience. I mean, really, I was not writing about the Panther experience in New Jersey. And one of my very good friends, who actually was from San Francisco, we didn't know each other here, but there in New Jersey, she used to call me Little Miss Anonymity, because I didn't come forth with it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. And before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you, for a new generation of women of color that is leading through activism or art or anything else, like tech is a big part of the area as well, what radical lessons from your journey would you like to pass forward?
I think people already know this. You can't do it alone. You need support systems all along the way. You need like-minded people around you. You need fellow travelers around you. And then you need to have tremendous gratitude for all of that. And then we come to the end of our lives. And here I am, gray and about to be what I call 5 minutes from 80, about to enter my 79th year of life, or my 80th year of life. When you hit 79, you're entering your 80th year of life. So I need other people more than ever now.
Yeah.
So I think that's my lesson.
How old were you when you published your first book? Because I know you've been writing for a long time. And I personally was very inspired when, I saw that your amazing sort of publication started not that long ago.
65.
65. Imagine.
When I was in my 20s, late 20s and early 30s, then, like many other people, I got into astrology, which I continued, my interest in, and palmistry, phrenology, facial physiognomy, all of the mystic arts. I got into them, love them, the tarot, the I Ching, and all of them independently said, you're not going to be successful until you're very old. Well, nobody in their 20s and 30s wants to hear that. So, excuse me? I don't think so. So I put all those thoughts aside. Even these are called rascets, these little wrinkles here, these lines, kind of like a bracelet. And they said, oh my God, you're going to be such an old woman. I didn't want to hear any of that. And even one person even pinpointed it and even said, and that's why I believe in the mystics. I believe in the mystic arts, but they're very dangerous. They can interfere with your free will.
Yes.
But one of them even said, 65 is going to be a turning point for you. 65? Are you even kidding? Get out of my face. So, yeah, baby.
Yeah, that's true. And I just wanted to point that out. Like it's never too late. Like in your case, you continue to build that foundation. You continue to find that true voice. You continue to draw from your experiences. You continue to build those experiences for you. And here you are.
Nichiren Buddhism teaches that life is eternal.
Yes.
It's infinite.
Yes.
And that we go in and out, life, death, life, death, life, death, through a cycle. And whatever you didn't finish, now you're going to get a chance. Another chance. It's all right. I loved it when Wayne Shorter, the great jazz musician and Nichiren Buddhist, was on his deathbed. His wife said, well, it's time to get a new body. That's what I love about Buddhism, is that the great sense of hope, and the belief in infinity. I love that.
Wonderful. So we'll end at that note.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you for your time.
You for even thinking of me. Okay.
Thank you. Bye, Judy.
Thank you for listening to The Courage Curve. I hope this conversation offered you perspective, comfort, or a sense of companionship as you move through your own moment of change, especially if you're choosing courage before clarity. And remember, women rise best when we rise together. Follow the show and share it with a woman who may need it.